Everybody, welcome to the show.
Welcome.
Amy and I are delighted to see you. I'm not trying to exaggerate or to sound like a broken record lately, but do we have a show for them today?
It just keeps coming.
This one's on fire. I have a question. Let's just say let's say 6 weeks ago, was the thought that you were having in your head, you know what feels feasible and possible is that I'm going to have an hour-long conversation with Malcolm Gladwell. Was that the thought?
So no. No, not even a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you had told me, I would have said you're a dirty liar.
Sure.
But here we are.
Here we are. Frankly, that thought would not have been in my head either, ma'am. And I've had a podcast for 7 years. So this is a big, awesome, incredible conversation with one of our most premier thinkers and analysts. And I mean, I didn't sleep last night. You'll hear more about that later. But Malcolm is just this fascinating person. He's both so smart that it is embarrassing, and then also warm and engaging and like earnest. And I don't know how he threads this particular needle, but he does it. He makes his work of science and data interesting, engaging, fascinating, and dare I say cool.
Yes.
I don't know how he does it.
And delivers it in there's a kindness to him also.
I agree.
I mean, I think he's gifted in his ability to research things and understand data, and gifted as a storyteller, but he's also honed his craft.
Yes, he has.
His particular craft.
Yes, he has.
For decades.
You're right. I mean,
he works so hard and yet has a humility, a kindness, still so curious about things.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to it. But Malcolm's work has us thinking about various ways that Gen X, because get excited for Gen Excellence.
It's Gen Excellence. Gen Excellence. Gen Excellence.
Tackled some pretty big issues and brought them to our little doorstep as we were coming up of age, and made them relatable, or maybe brought them to our attention for the first time, or handed us a story that we were going to consider or examine in a new way, or maybe for the first time ever. And so let's talk in this installment of Gen Excellence about music. Okay, so let me ask you first. Was there, because there'd be more than one, so just pick a particular song in our coming of age that took a complex issue or idea or tension point, whatever, however you want to pick it, and either distilled it down for you in an understandable way, or brought it to your attention for the first time, or made you ask new questions, or anything like that?
But I think the first song that I tied to a specific political or cultural event was Sunday Bloody Sunday.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I was in middle school.
Yeah, what year did that come out? Do you even know? Let me see.
I think I was 6th grade.
I'm looking.
Maybe
1983.
83.
Yeah.
So
God.
That's not a chorus you sing along and don't think about.
Yeah.
You know, like those are some strong words.
Yeah.
So, I went to the encyclopedia.
Sure, that's what we had, the Britannicas.
That was in my hallway.
Yeah.
And asked questions.
Yeah.
Like, what's he talking about?
Yeah. I'm like, where's Ireland?
And that was my first introduction to U2 also.
Oh, yeah.
So, I think maybe there were a few other songs on that album that also were political and big and dark.
Yes.
So
U2 has been doing that for decades.
Yes.
That is a good one. I would add to that, I was not paying a lot of attention to the world when I was a teen and even a young adult. I was very myopic And my world at that time was really, really small. I mean, I lived on the head of a needle, and I just did not have this broader sense of the world at all. So when I was a senior in high school is when REM came out with Losing My Religion. I just remember I did not know how to think about that song. I was like, that's me in the corner. Like, that's me in the spotlight. I didn't know we could lose our religion. I didn't know it was allowed. I didn't know we were allowed to even have cognitive dissonance with religion. I did not know we were allowed to have hard questions. I certainly did not think we were allowed to lose it. Damn. And I just thought, well, REM needs to go to church. They need to go to Sunday school and find it again. But that kind of song sticks in your craw.
It does, but did you keep listening to it, or were you like, no, too much?
No, I kept listening to it. I couldn't have identified it at the time, but clearly I had some internal low rumbling river inside of me that was like bubbling with questions. And the cognitive dissonance for me was the hard part. That this is what we believe, but my eyes were seeing so much harm from it. Or this is what I've been taught, but that doesn't feel fair, or it doesn't feel good, or it feels unjust.
Or not true in my own body.
Or not true in exactly. So my body was giving me some messages, but I just was not raised in a community that was able to have doubts, or even just hard questions or hard conversations. Those were seen as a dereliction of faith. So anyway, Losing My Religion, I was like, well, I'm going to pray for them, but also, I wonder what that means. Anyways.
I do think music is so uniquely positioned.
It is.
To take huge ideas and distill it down into a single chorus that just...
You're right.
Alters your perception of the world.
It's so true. That is so true. Music is very, 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 very powerful, and has always carried subversive messaging and cultural ideas. Always. I mean, way before our generation. That was still happening, so at least on the margins, certainly. And now that's found its way more to the center of the bullseye. But we could probably do that again for 100 years. Just going through the songs that have moved us and changed us and challenged us. And we could, except what's important is that we get to Malcolm Gladwell. That's what's important. That's why we're here. That's why you're here. And when I tell you, you're going to be so glad that you hit that download button today. All that is interesting, obviously. However, we have something of a superstar on the show today. Both of us are nervous a little bit, to be honest with you. Maybe you've heard of him. Malcolm Gladwell is here today. How'd you sleep last night?
Well, besides being a little nervous, I also had 1 million things to think about from his book.
So much same. Just in case you I don't know what. Just moved here. You just moved here from a remote country. Let me tell you about Malcolm. He's been a mega influencer, not just on our American culture, but really on the world, and changing our perspectives surrounding human behavior for 30 years.
Yes.
This is what he's known for. He has this really interesting ability to, it's crazy, I told him this, but transform these very complex ideas that are data dense into these engaging stories that all of a sudden you're 20 pages in and you're like, how did I get this deep in the bag on the Harvard women's rugby team? Right. Yeah. He's a super prominent voice in discussions about everything from crime to education to sports to psychology. He studies social phenomenon and tipping points, if you will. So his deal in the world seems to be challenging our understanding of human behavior and examining or maybe re-examining things that we've either misunderstood or we're looking at from the wrong angle. This is his particular magic in the world. I was reading his book just thinking, how does he think? How does he do this? How does his brain know to ask the right question? To me, that is fascinating. I see that I'm asking the question everyone else is asking, and Malcolm's over here playing chess while we're playing checkers, coming at it from a different angle and drilling in to the side door, and that's really the access to the idea. And so he's done this through a bunch of New York Times bestsellers. The Tipping Point, his original Tipping Point, Blink, Der Outliers, Talking to Strangers, there's a bunch more. And he has a podcast called Revisionist History where he re-examines something from the past and asks whether we got it right the first time. Interesting. So today, we're particularly going to talk about his newest book. It comes out October 1st. His crew sent Amy and I a copy in advance, and so we have read it, and it is, well, just buzzy. It's like brain buzzy in the best possible way. It's called Revenge of the Tipping Point, Overstories, Super Spreaders, and the Rise of Social Engineering. And all those words end up making sense once you read his book. So what he did here is he returned 25 years later after his original bestseller, The Tipping Point. He speaks about this, but originally he was just going to sort of revise it or update it. But 25 years later, he came to some of these big themes and ideas and realized he has changed and the world has changed. So it's a completely new book. Very much located in today's culture with today's events and these consequences of understanding tipping points. It is fascinating. It is absolutely fascinating. And so we did our best to pare down our questions, but we had 100 that we didn't get to. He's just one of, I was just saying this to Malcolm, but he's this very fascinating combination that I find rare, which is this science brain where he deals in analytics and data and very complex issues. But he does it with a storyteller's master touch. I don't know. It's that's not fair.
It's not. He's incredible at what he does.
He's incredible at what he does. I'm trying to think of who would I consider his peer or his equal, and I'm drawing a blank.
I don't know.
This either really veers a lot into the world of just this is too dense for the average Joe to process, or it's all story, all hyperbole, it's somehow he marries the two. So anyway, he's genius, and we are really lucky that we get a conversation with Malcolm Gladwell. We're just two girls sitting here in green chairs in Austin. So you're going to love this conversation. He's as fascinating in person as he is on the page. So enjoy this talk with Amy and myself and the incomparable Malcolm Gladwell. Well, it sounds strange to come out of my mouth, but I would like to say good morning to you, Malcolm Gladwell.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning to you too.
We are so glad to have you on the show. So, first of all, thank you. Revenge of the Tipping Point. We're going to talk about this, your latest book. It comes out October 1st, and your crew sent us over a couple of copies, and we have read every word. So,
good.
Well, I guess, first of all, you and I are in a little bit of a fight because I was going through it yesterday. That was my plan. Let me go through it. Let me get a good feel of this. Let me see where we're at. And then what I did is I read every single word, and I finished at 1 a.m. And then I laid awake until 2:30 just thinking about it. And so
I robbed you of a night's sleep.
Yeah, I'm a little mad at you, but you're forgiven for coming on the show. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. We've been texting each other nonstop all morning, just discussing interesting elements that we learned from you and from this book and that we're excited to hear you talk about. So let's get into it. Revenge of the Tipping Point, everybody. Overstories, super spreaders, and the rise of social engineering. It's a callback to your first big swing. Obviously, the tipping point. Everybody who lives in anywhere knows about that book. And so I'd love to hear you talk about this whole concept, why you decided to circle back, why you didn't just revise what you had written, but you actually wrote a whole new book, and why the concept was still important and relevant, but what you've examined here is, well, it's pretty brilliant.
My original plan was just to we were going to do re-release the original Tipping Point and just update it, make it seem a little more modern. And I sort of got into it halfway through, and I thought, this is impossible for any number of reasons. One is it's 25 years old. And, imagine having a conversation with yourself from 25 years ago.
Right.
I mean, you're very young, so I imagine.
Clearly. Obviously.
You would be
I was a wee baby of 25 years ago.
And so that's just hard, right? To kind of reconnect with something that you were thinking and saying quarter century ago. The other thing I realized is that when I first wrote The Tipping Point, the idea that you would use the metaphor of the epidemic to describe the way ideas and behaviors work was a relatively new idea. It was novel. It struck people as like, oh, that's interesting, right? It's no longer novel. It's now part of the way we think about the world. We talk about things going viral. As part of our vocabulary, we assume that the ideas and rules of the epidemic are a great way to explain how ideas spread. So that the task has changed. I'm no longer introducing an idea to people. Now I'm explaining the dimensions of an idea. Yeah. And once I realized that, I was like, I can't just reissue this thing that's become, kind of part of the way we think. I have to take it in a new direction. And also, it's way more fun to write a book from scratch. I mean, who wouldn't rather kind of like plunge in and explore new things and go over something that was written. I wrote that book in the late 90s.
Yeah. I mean the world is so different.
Yeah, it's just, I didn't remember. Do you remember what you were doing in the late 90s? I don't. I was like, I barely have any. I could barely,
No.
What I was listening to, what I was wearing, it just seems like another.
It's another planet. I was having babies. I was completely out of the public zeitgeist because my days revolved around toddlers. So I missed the late 90s. What happened? I have no idea. I wonder if you wouldn't mind, before I kick it over to Amy here for a second, can you kind of explain the premise, really, of The Revenge of the Tipping Point, the puzzle that you're piecing together, and the sort of bones that you hang all the meat on?
Yeah. So the original Tipping Point was based on a very simple idea, which was that epidemics and the rules of epidemics, the rules that explain why a virus can spread through a community or a country and ignite an entire epidemic, can also be used to explain the spread of ideas and behaviors. That ideas and behaviors can be contagious, just like COVID was, right? And that once you know those rules, you can gain real insight into how to spread ideas, how to prevent behaviors from tipping. It gives you all kinds of insight, in other words, in how you should intervene and react to the world. In this book, what I did is kept that core notion and just said, let's take it one step further. And let's ask ourselves, are there people, are there institutions, are there situations where people are using the rules of epidemics to spread ideas and behaviors or products or whatever in ways that we're not aware of? Are they using the rules of epidemics behind our backs? Are we being deceived because we're not being smart about how epidemic rules govern the way our society behaves? So it's a little more of a lot of this book is kind of a warning to people about how sort of underneath the surface, either deliberately or kind of inadvertently, people are hatching epidemics, are promoting them, are furthering them. And we need to sort of, if we want to kind of understand that process, we need to be smarter. And so I talk about in this book, I talk about COVID, I talk about a little town, a beautiful little town that had a terrible tragedy. I talk about why Miami is the weirdest city in America. I talk about all these kinds of, they're all illustrations of kind of the ways in which epidemics work in these kinds of quiet and subtle ways, and what we can do about that knowledge.
Can you talk about the importance of an overstory? What does that look like?
So this is something I didn't get into in my first book, and it's an idea that I really kind of fell in love with in writing this book. And it might be I think it's the most interesting idea in the book. It started by, if you look in the world of medicine, what you discover is this really weird thing, which is the way in which you're treated by a doctor for any number of diseases differs dramatically from one city or town to the next. If you have a heart attack in Chicago, you're going to get a very different kind of care than if you have a heart attack in Los Angeles, which doesn't make any sense, right? Because you would think that cardiologists all across America are all going to good medical schools, learning the same things. You could be at world-class hospitals in both places. But what we've discovered is that for any number of different medical conditions, communities of physicians have their own ideas about how to treat them. It's almost as if there's like an overstory, a kind of cloud over Chicago and LA and Buffalo, New York, and Boston, that kind of affects the way people behave in ways they may not be entirely aware of. And I took that idea and I say, I think that's true of lots of things beyond medical care. That there are tons of different ways in which the way in which we think about an issue or a problem is sort of being framed by our community, by the kind of the rules that we kind of commonly agree on and how to think about a problem. So I tackled the problem of gay marriage. Yeah. For years and years and years in this country, it was unthinkable that we would let gay people marry. And why do we think that? Is it because we hated gay people? Some cases maybe, but maybe not. It was more that we had a set of kind of assumptions we all commonly held about what gay people were capable of. And our idea was that homosexuality was incompatible with committed relationships. Right. That was, committed relationships was for straight people, right? We just all accepted that rule, that kind of way of framing gay marriage. And that's why gay marriage, there were decades when the fight for gay marriage went nowhere. And that's why it went nowhere, because they couldn't break that kind of fundamental assumption we had about gay people. And then that changes, and it changes almost overnight in the early 2000s. And we go from a country that was resolutely opposed to gay marriage within the space of a decade to a country that it's just treated like, well, of course, yeah. Gay people should be able to get married if they want. And that chapter is all about how on earth did that happen? Yeah. And no one predicted that. That's the other interesting thing. Even people who were fighting for gay marriage thought they were engaged in a 50-year fight or a 40-year fight. And they were as stunned as anyone else that they won the battle in the space of 5 or 6 years. And I think it's because the overstory changed. Yeah. That something happened to trigger a change in that kind of, in our baseline assumption about what gay people were capable of when it came to relationships. And so that chapter is all about, okay, so what changed the overstory? And I don't think I'm giving too much away when I say, I really do think it was Will and Grace.
Yes. And
I get into why Will and Grace, I think Will and Grace is one of the most revolutionary television shows of the last 100 years. I mean, it's in retrospect, an extraordinarily important TV show.
It was fascinating to read that particular analysis because, of course, we lived that in real time.
Yeah.
and
Oh, you
watch.
guys are
wa-
big watchers.
Of course. I
Yes.
mean, I recently heard Sean Hayes even talking about this, that at the time, they didn't even necessarily know they were making something revolutionary. Now,
Yeah.
they to some degree they did. To some degree, to your really good points that you make, they were breaking rules, one after another in rapid succession. But even then, the sum was greater than its parts, and reversed in quick order a whole nation. The overstory idea is so fascinating, and I find myself wanting you to apply it to a million things. I have all these subgroups that are coming up in my conscience, like, oh, I understand the overstory for that subgroup, and I understand that it's something of a monoculture. And as you say, epidemics love a monoculture. And I'm first of all curious how you even self-selected the various stories that you told, because they are all over the place. They are geographically located, they're national, in some cases they're international, they are big ideas, they're smaller ideas, they're located in Harvard, they're located in Miami. How did these stories find you? Did you find them? Did you leave 100 on the cutting room floor?
Yeah. This one was fun. I got about sort of a third away into this book. I got into it in a way I've rarely gotten into writing a book. And I just, I got kind of super curious and began to realize the ideas that I was pursuing were just popping up in a million places. But where did I get my ideas? From, 100 different sources. I was randomly reading, there's a chapter that you were just referring to about this town called Poplar Grove. It's not its real name. I don't give the real name of the town in the story. And it's this perfect town. It is, I went there, I figured out it's what its real name was. And I went there and took a tour with a real estate agent. And it's like, it is, if you went there and you were like, oh my God, it is this gorgeous upper middle class. It has every public amenity you want. The schools are fantastic. The neighborhoods are gorgeous. Everyone talks about what a close-knit community it is. I mean, I could go on and on. There's no crime. I mean, it's where you'd want to raise your kids. And yet, that chapter is about, they have been suffering through this, I'm not going to say what it was, but an extraordinary tragedy that's unfolded over the course of the last 10, 15 years. And I heard about that. I just was randomly reading these sociology papers because it was something I was interested in. And then I randomly ran across this paper by these two professors, Anna Muller and Seth Arberton. And they start talking about this town they will only refer to as Poplar Grove. And it was just so disturbing and fascinating and weird. And I called them up and I just read your paper, published in some obscure academic journal. I was like, you guys blew my mind. We have to talk about this. So we started to talk about it, and I call up one, then the other, then both of them together. I was consumed with, and then I sat down and I figured out what the town was and went to the town and did all this background research. So that's a case where I just ran across a mention in an academic. But in the other case, there's a chapter on the Holocaust. Yeah. That comes from, I was having a conversation with this friend of mine, my friend Michael. And Michael said, he's talking about something else entirely. And he goes, that he's a child of, his parents or his grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Yeah. And he said, that no one talked about the Holocaust until the 1970s. And I was like, that's ridiculous.
That's what we said. True. We both just sat down and said, did you know that?
We had no idea.
I'd never heard anybody say that, or I had no idea. I was born in 1974, so by the time I came of age, everyone was talking about it.
And I was like, Michael, that's nonsense. He goes, no, it's true. And Michael says, I always try to fact check what Michael said. And Michael's like, my grandparents never talked about it. I was like, okay, maybe that's just your grandparents. Sure. He goes, no, but no one. So then I started digging into it. And I was like, oh, it's true. I got one of the weirdest things I talk about. I got the standard history textbook of the Second World War that you would read in a college freshman history class in the 1960s and 70s. I went back and got those exact editions. And I said, okay, I'm going to test this out. And I read through. So these are 500-page textbooks on the Second World War. And I said, I'm going to read and see how much they have to say about the Holocaust. And they say nothing about the Holocaust. Like 3 lines.
Yeah.
They have more on, there's one of the textbooks, has more on like some classical musician than they do on the Holocaust. Like, it's nuts. And so that was, where you get that I was like, what happened?
Yeah.
And it's an overstory chapter where I say, we had an overstory which said we're not going to talk. No one was denying that it happened. But there was an overstory that said we can't talk about it. And the overstory changed. And it changed overnight. And that's what the chapter's all about. But it's another kind of powerful, this is why I got so in love with overstories. It's like, we live in a world now where it's more than fine. It is encouraged to talk about an event like that.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for us to imagine that our society could have been in a period where it was not okay to talk about it. But that's exactly what happened.
And that was recent.
Yeah. I mean, in my life, not in your lifetime, but in mine.
Towards the end, when you're talking about overstories, one thing you say is, most of the time, you say that's the nature of an overstory. Most of the time, we don't bother to look up at the ideas circulating above in the forest canopy, which made me start thinking, what are we missing right now? There's so much going on. Things are changing exponentially faster than they used to. Like, what overstories are we living under and have no clue? Like, what things can change within a tiny bit of time that we thought were immovable? Like, it's just
true.
Can't stop thinking about.
And we think we're free thinkers. We think we're full of independent thought and autonomy, but we're under overstories too. And I see them play out in various subcultures that I'm in. And so it, for me too, left me going, wait, what am I under? What am I not paying attention? What do I need to look up and see? So I love your question. I'd love to hear what you think about that. What sort of major overstories are guiding the zeitgeist right now?
I mean, it's a sort of an obvious one, but I wonder whether the overstory that is over our heads right now that we're not thinking about is one that says the most important way to understand ourselves and our differences from others is to look through the lens of politics. I think politics and political ideology has somehow kind of become central in a way that it wasn't in previous. I feel like 25 years ago, I didn't particularly care how someone voted in the previous election, or I cared, but it wasn't. There were a million other ways where I could. There were a million different ways in which I could find a way to find common ground with somebody, or define someone. Politics wouldn't have been the first.
Totally.
And I feel like it's become the first. And I think and we're not aware of the fact that we're doing that or how unnatural that is. Because the truth is that for most of us, even though sometimes we pretend that politics is the most important thing that shapes us, it's not. I mean, if you're a parent or a Christian or an Army veteran, these are all identities that are infinitely more important to you than how you voted in 2022, the congressional elections or whatever, or how you're going to vote in November. So that's a kind of weird thing that I think is going on right now that we're not sort of paying attention to. And I'm hopeful that will shift. I would much rather people define themselves in using other categories, because those other categories are far more meaningful to them ultimately, right? I think, so that would be, but on other things, I mean, part of the problem with asking that question is it's really hard to identify these things in the moment. We're blind to them in the moment. People in the 70s, 60s didn't realize they were under an overstory that said they couldn't talk about the Holocaust. It just never. It wasn't until later that they said, "Wait a minute, how what were we doing?" There were no, in the chapter I talk about, there were no Holocaust museums or memorials in America.
That's right.
Until the 80s. It's nuts. 40 years after the war's over. There's one exception. I talk about that in LA. But so you don't you're not kind of, it's something that you kind of wake up one day and you say to yourself, wow, what were we doing?
I told Amy this morning, I'm dying to hear you lay your particular brand of genius analysis over the idea of what is the role of social media in this puzzle, because it's the biggest change in our lifetime for sure. A monumental cultural shift that is not geographically located. It's the whole world. And when I think about the idea that you presented on super spreaders and power in the hands of a few, and how it can all be manipulated, which I want to talk to you about in a second. But where do you see even socials playing into this interesting puzzle where overstories are created? But at this point, they're created and they're changing so quickly. And then they have this dissemination capacity that's new. And we had decided behind your back this morning that this must be surely your next project, and you're probably working on it, and you're 50,000 words in already. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on where social media fits in here.
Well, so, as you know, a big chunk of this book is devoted to this idea of the super spreader. The idea that in an epidemic, a small number of people do all the work. And it was an idea that I explored in my first book, A Tipping Point. I called it The Law of the Few. But this time around, as I revisited that idea, I realized that in the world we live in, that's become even more exaggerated. So it's not just that a few people have a large amount of influence. It's that a very, very, very small number of people have a very, very large amount of influence. So we become even more kind of asymmetrical in how social power is distributed. And so you have this situation, where if you look at something like Twitter or TikTok, or where a very small number of people have a massive amount of reach, right? And so we're narrowing the number of, when we look at how we're influenced, the number of sources and people who are projecting influence in the world is getting smaller and smaller, which is weird because we thought the opposite was happening. We thought in the modern world what we were doing was diversifying the number of sources we had for information. I think that's not true. I think when I'm on Twitter or whatever, I think that like most people, I am being guided in ways I don't even appreciate by the views and perspectives of just a small number of people who have massive audiences. And, that's like, when I walk around Manhattan and I see a restaurant like that overnight goes from being empty to having a line down the block, and it's because someone Instagrammed it, right? And somebody with a massive audience Instagrammed it, and suddenly every single tourist has decided to settle in that restaurant. Like that did not happen.
That's right.
20 years ago. Someone would write a review in a newspaper and you would have a hard time getting a reservation for 2 weeks. But you never had to line around the block the next morning.
Exactly.
So the whole thing's gotten exaggerated and sped up. And living in that world, that's what I find jarring. It's just like, it's so much more extreme. It's happening so much faster, and like it's overnight in this kind of, there's a restaurant I go to, just opened a couple months ago near my house. I live upstate New York, and Al Roker lives in like the area.
Okay.
And he's a big restaurant goer, and he's got a massive, as you can imagine, Instagram following.
Sure.
And we go to this restaurant. It's really good. There's no one there. And I remember I say, my partner Kate says to me, I really hope Al Roker doesn't post on this restaurant because
Right,
we're
he's
never
gonna
going to
blow
get
it up.
never going to get a reservation again. We go back this weekend. It's jammed. There's like no
He
room at the
found
bar
it.
anymore. And we said to the hostess, "Did Al Roker post?" She goes, "Yeah, I
You knew it.
did." We just know it's Al Roker. It's like
It's Al
Al
Roker.
Roker's effect on
That
my
guy.
world. It's like I've never met him. He's like he's governing my life. It's
governing
exactly
my
what
life.
we're talking about, though. Like
Yeah.
Al Roker has this outsized influence on my little town. He goes around and what he likes, it's just like boom, it just blows up.
I want to dig into this idea for a couple layers underneath the idea of being a super spreader, because I think what was one of the more fascinating angles in the book was how sometimes the super spreaders are it's not a moral choice, it's inadvertent, like when you talked about COVID. The physical, literal super spreaders. But then, you applied it to other epidemics and said, there are bad actors here.
Yeah.
And if we're willing to be super honest about this, we can take a look at what the power of a few can do and why over the entire zeitgeist. And so I would like to hear you talk a little bit more about why it matters that we are paying attention, that super spreaders can be manipulative and are doing that on purpose. And there is an agenda on the table to do so, and incentive for them, of course, to control a narrative that we are just, again, the canopy's up here, we're under its shadow, but may not be looking up to see exactly what that story is.
Yeah. So I begin and end the book with the story of OxyContin and the opioid crisis, which I think is the perfect illustration of what the book is about. And at core, the reason we have an opioid crisis in this country, which, by the way, no country in the world has an opioid crisis anything like
I
ours.
saw that.
Right? And the reason why did America have this unbelievable, more than 100,000 people are now dying every year from opioid overdoses. It starts with this drug, OxyContin, marketed by Purdue Pharmaceutical drug company. And what sets Purdue apart is that they take the kind of laws of epidemics more seriously than any other drug company ever has. Particularly, they take the idea of super spreaders more seriously. And they realize that you don't need, if you have a drug, a prescription drug, and you need doctors to prescribe it, and prescribe it in large numbers if you're going to make a lot of money. What they realized was they didn't have to convince the average doctor to prescribe their drug, or even most doctors, or even 95% of doctors. Yeah. All they needed was the top 2% of doctors to be their super spreaders. That, 1,000 doctors sprinkled throughout the United States who could be manipulated by Purdue would be enough to kickstart a massive nationwide epidemic. So when we looked at the opioid crisis, a lot of people said this is an indictment of the medical profession because they're the ones who prescribed this recklessly and caused addiction and all this thing that spiraled into heroin and fentanyl. That's wrong. The medical profession as a whole behaved in an exemplary manner.
Yeah.
They understood how dangerous this was. They did not prescribe it to anyone who walked in the door. A tiny, tiny fraction of people who were manipulated and directed and controlled by Purdue Pharma were the ones responsible for creating this epidemic. And you've got to, in other words, if you want to prevent this from happening again, you got to shift your perspective. You got to stop assuming this is a fundamental problem with a profession, and start saying, no, this is a problem with a very, very small number of bad apples at the margins who have hugely disproportionate power, right? Imagine if Al Roker was evil.
That's right.
That's what we're talking about, right?
Back
It's
to
evil
Al. I'm sure he
it's
loved
evil
being the
Al
subject
Roker.
of this interview.
Yeah, thank God he's like a warm and wonderful guy who's about spreading cheer and goodwill.
Sure.
But that notion of the super spreader, you got to sort of revisit your assumptions about why social problems happen and about what you're going to do about them. I don't go into crime in this book, but I've been working on a separate thing about crime. We now realize that crime is the same thing that what they call the last 5 years, 10 years have seen the rise of what's called precision policing in the United States. And that is when you take a big city like the United States and you say, we really only need to be paying attention to a few thousand people. The violent crime is being driven by an incredibly small number of people. We need to identify them and intervene. And everyone else, the days when you were harassing entire populations of people to lower crime, that's just ridiculous. That's not where the crime is. The crime is a very, very small number of people, and you can find them and treat them differently and leave everybody else alone. That's a really, really socially positive insight that I think is being applied slowly being applied in any number of areas.
You've been writing about social phenomena for decades. What has surprised you the most recently, a change in society?
Well, that's a really good question. I guess, what has surprised me the most? Any number of things. One is that how these kinds of trends, rules, things show up earlier and earlier, which I guess is a kind of commonplace thing. But what I mean is that we now talk about these epidemics, and we're talking about 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds. And before we thought, when we talk about a mental health crisis, 50 years ago, when we talked about mental health crises, we talked about people in their 20s and 30s or midlife crisis. Remember that was...
Sure.
The midlife crisis was
the only
one
we knew.
And then now we're talking about teenagers. And that, the idea that the contagion, and these things are contagious, that the contagion has moved down and affected younger and younger people, like my chapter on Poplar Grove. It's about kids. It's not about adults. That really disturbs me. There's something the idea that we haven't managed to protect children and youth from adult problems is, I think, a very kind of deeply worrisome phenomenon. When I hear about kids in college, a mental health crisis in college, and I just think, the whole point of college is supposed to be fun.
Yeah.
College is where you go away from your parents and you discover who you are and you make friends for life and you learn stuff that the whole idea was that it was this magical moment in your life, right? That you would cherish for the rest of your days and the world would open up to you. And now we're saying that whatever insane percentage of college kids are facing mental health problems. I was like, how did that happen? That's heartbreaking, right?
Yeah.
Dang it. We have a million other things we want to talk to you about. This is infuriating to try to fit all of these incredible ideas into one interview. The idea of monocultures and the interesting power of thirds that you discuss. I want to hear you talk for a million hours about how are we ever going to get to the tipping point for sort of white supremacy and racial, justice when it comes to just simply that 25-30% space.
Yeah.
I want to hear you talk about how this applies to evangelical subculture and how that overstory has changed at the hands of a tiny, tiny few and the moral majority. And here we have a completely different zeitgeist now, but it took a whole generation. We don't have time. But I am so excited for this book to be out into the world and for the conversations it's going to start. I will tell you, just as a person, I sat there, like I told you, at 2 a.m. when your books rattled around in my brain and I couldn't get my eyes to shut. I found myself going, how can I apply this to my life? Where where do I need to examine these huge systems and these big trends, and what overstories am I living under, and what portions of my life are not to that 25-30% tipping point. Anyway, it has huge cultural impact and relevance, but also personal. And so I think this is going to spawn some really interesting discussions and hopefully cultural change. I'm looking forward to everybody reading it. It comes out October 1st, right?
That's right.
Is there anything that you can just finally tell our listeners about? I mean, come on, man. I mean, you're Malcolm Gladwell. So where do we find Malcolm Gladwell? I guess all over the internet. But where to find you, where to find your body of incredible work, and particularly the new book?
Well, I will say I have on my podcast, Revisionist History, I'm doing a series of companion episodes to the book.
Nice.
And I'm going to tease, I'm doing 2 episodes. So remember, there's a chapter in the book on Miami and why Miami is so crazy. And I talk about this case of this guy called Philip S. Forms, who's this fascinating, wacky nursing home tycoon. And his lawyers did a nut case, which I talk about very briefly in the Harvard chapter.
Oh, yes. You're not going to be getting a commencement address invitation there anytime soon.
And I do 2, so I only told the story of half that case. And in this podcast episode, 2 episodes, I tell the story of the other half of the case, which is hilarious.
Is it?
It's like, it is so, I'm so proud of these 2 episodes. They're called The Georgetown Massacre, Part 1 and Part 2. They will be out on Revisionist History at the beginning of October. They will whet your appetite for the book, I suspect, I hope. And they are so much fun and so weird and strange, and it's like a little legal thriller in 2 parts in Revisionist History. So that's what I would love to plug.
Perfect. We'll round all that up for all of our listeners. They can find it all from you and for you.
Okay, well, I have 20 tabs open on my laptop from reading the book, and I haven't even started on the footnotes.
Right.
Oh my God.
I feel like I finished the book and I have to go back from page 1. Footnotes, the bibliography. I loved all of it.
It's fascinating.
I'm nowhere near done.
No, I agree. And you're such an interesting thinker, because you are a precision analyst and researcher, but with the heart of a storyteller, which is so rare. We don't usually see the convergence of those 2 gifts, for you to be able to take complicated and in some cases even dense data, and then all of a sudden it's 2:30 in the morning and I'm invested in insurance fraud in Miami. Like, I don't know how you did that, but you got me. So wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for the labor that it was to bring this to bear. This is a lot of work. This is a lot of work. The bibliography is like 7,000 pages long. So we're delighted to have you on the show and excited to continue this conversation with our community for sure. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day.
Well,
Hi.
that was boring. Tra-la-la.
While we were conducting the interview, I was still typing questions.
Yeah.
Maybe I can squeeze this one in. Like,
I was too.
Like, hey, ask him this. Like,
Totally.
I just thought of this one.
I know. And then I had some questions I wanted to give them to you. I'm like, you ask him this. We could have gone on for 10 hours easily. Such an interesting. I don't know. What's your takeaway here? Do you have a takeaway? I know we just had this interview, but or thought that you're this resonant in your brain that keeps rattling around.
No, it's all still rattling. Like the ideas are so big that it takes a while to integrate it into like what I thought before. trying to figure out if what I thought before was wrong. And I keep thinking of 100 other scenarios to apply
Same.
these rules to.
Oh my gosh,
what
same.
about this?
Yes.
Like, what if an overstory moves geographical locations, and then you have that kind of chaos in this new place? Like
he did with the like medical
Yes.
example in the book. Yeah.
So my takeaway is, as I said earlier, I'm going to start on the footnotes now.
God, you really are too. Listen, you guys, you're getting to know Amy, but when she says she's going to take her second pass through this material and go deep in the weeds, she will. Like, that's going to happen.
Well, one thing we were wondering is how does he come up with these ideas? Like, what's the path his brain takes? And one thing he says in his masterclass on writing is the way to know what a writer is thinking, what their path was to look in the footnotes, and then to look in those footnotes. And
That's interesting.
this idea that just because something's not current doesn't mean it's relevant could not be further from the truth. Like
history has a lot to show us and teach us. Yeah.
books versus TikTok.
Yeah.
Like, dig in and go see, and like see the threads
That's true.
that he pulled from this data set and this newspaper article.
That's true.
And figure it out. But now I want to do that myself also.
Oh, yeah. Footnotes will show you all his rabbit trails. Like how he got to, he just gave us the tip of the spear.
Right.
But the footnotes show, he spent 70 hours on this idea. I'll tell you what I cannot quit thinking about. When I think about our particular subculture that we were raised in, I wish all of our listeners have read the book so they could locate this a little bit more cleanly into these ideas. But I keep thinking about this idea of epidemics, the contagious effect of them and how they spread. And some epidemics are for good. Like you heard us talk about like Will and Grace. Will and Grace created an epidemic of changing the cultural narrative around gay marriage that was super contagious and reversed basically a nation's general idea about that in 6 years. So, contagious can be for good or for ill, but I keep thinking about this idea of evangelical subculture because he posits that a lot of these subcultures are geographically located. But this one isn't. It's disseminated throughout all of America, but there is definitely an overstory. And, we're sitting here watching the essentially faith community that raised us look so different.
So different
than when we were raised. And I think about this idea of super spreaders and how overstories are shifted at the hands of a teeny tiny few on purpose, in many cases, with an agenda. And I think about the super spreaders of the moral majority. I think about Falwell. I think about, this very small, concentrated group of powerful, religious white men who had a political agenda and then changed the cultural narrative around abortion. That was their lightning rod, and galvanized an entire culture all the way to the point where we have today. I cannot count how many people in our community have said, I've lost my grandparents. I've lost them. The grandparents that I used to know are so radicalized at this point, and they have the overstory in their life is so severe and so baked in, like we can't pull them out by the ankles anymore. And so
it's a perfect storm of the overstory changed. There was super spreaders and the rule of thirds.
And the rule of thirds, because that is not a diverse leadership base. We barely got into the rule of thirds with Malcolm.
No, not at all.
But the rule of thirds says that any given cultural construct experiences major shift at about the I'm doing a terrible job of being Malcolm right now, but
25 to
30%, where a minority culture hits the 25 or 30% mark, at that point, the entire cultural narrative can shift and does shift. It's very regular and predictable. Actually, it's interesting. But in a evangelical subculture, we're nowhere near that. Not in gender. It's led by men almost entirely. Not by race. It's white, almost entirely white. Certainly not by sexual identity, but that is
Right.
Anyway, I want to sit here and talk about this for 1,000 hours. But there's hope in it.
There's so much hope.
Yes.
One of the first things I did, one of my tabs I pulled up and sent to you, was the makeup of Congress.
Oh my God. Yes.
Like, apply the rule of thirds to the makeup of Congress.
That's
like,
right.
look at every demographic.
That's right.
Where are we?
Women, people of color, women of color.
Yes.
All of it. All the minority representation.
How close are we to that rule of thirds?
Yeah.
Where
We're getting there.
maybe there can be a tipping point.
Yeah. And according to his data and his research, there is.
There is.
Like, he explains how people get so shocked when a huge cultural shift happens, but he's like, it's predictable. People are at the 22% mark and have no idea how close they are. So they're feeling despair. Like, God, we're never going to get there. Like you said about the gay marriage work. We're 50 years away, and they were 4. So,
And didn't know it.
And didn't know it. But the numbers would have showed them that they were. Anyway, fascinating. Okay, well, if we haven't convinced you to read the book, I don't know who can.
Listen, order the book
Yeah.
and set aside 2 weeks
Yeah. I think that's right. Have a conversation partner at the ready.
and talk about it. Yes.
Yeah.
For another
absolutely.
year.
Anyway, per usual, if you go to jenhatmaker.com, we'll round all this up for you because Malcolm is like a deep well of content and material and resources. And so we'll round up all his socials, all of his books, all of his links, his podcast, which brilliant, everything. So that's jenhatmaker.com under the podcast tab, including this whole episode. If you want to share it, thanks for sharing episodes. We love it when you do that. And also thanks for subscribing. If you haven't already, it'll take you 5 seconds. Just go wherever you listen to podcasts, pull up For the Love and hit add plus follow, whatever the word is on that particular platform. But that way you are subscribed and you'll never miss an episode. And by the way, of course, we thank you so much for your reviews and your ratings. And we want, we read every one of those. So your feedback matters all the time to us. We're always listening to what you're interested in, what you want to hear about, who you want to hear from, any way we can make this show better for you. So thank you for every single comment you've ever given us. So, okay, sis, I feel like I need a nap. Except I'm too jazzed.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe what I need is run a mile. Jokes. Hilarious jokes. All right, you guys.
Thank y'all for listening.
Thanks for listening. See you next week.
Enjoy.